Hi everyone, my name is Brandon. I'm going to go ahead and start here with the second module. We're going to take a look at Mindware's HRV software. This program is quite intricate. There's a lot of options, so it's important not to get lost in the process of doing this. The first thing we need to do is bring up the program. When we do this, you'll need to make sure first that your key is inserted, and then from there you'll just click on the program. Once the program is brought up, you'll see that you'll have an option of pulling files from a number of locations. It's important that you pull the right file. In this case, I'm going to choose one of the preset files that I have organized here. You just click on that. Typically, if you're just opening up the program for the first time, this information won't be here. There'll be no edit data or the scaling file either. So just click on the file and press OK. And then from there, you'll need to set up these channels here. When you first open the program, these settings will not be set at all. All of them will say none. So it's important that you get these right, and then all the channels actually line up with the data that you're trying to analyze. In the first one, you'll have PPG. You don't have anything chosen there. Then you'll have BP, or blood pressure, in the second channel here. You'll also have blood pressure down here in this channel, but it's important you press none for that in that instance, just for the fact that we are not going to be doing that analysis right here, and this is the correct one, or this is the correct channel that we converted earlier in the process. If you don't understand, it's not a big deal. It's just important that we get everything set up here, especially the ECG, the event, and the Z0 right here, which will function as our respiration. So just take the time, set up all these, get them all correct, and then go ahead and press OK. Now that we've gotten into the main program here, you'll see that there are a number of things going on. First, we have the data file that we've just pulled from. Second, we have the file length. You'll have the mode up here, which we always want set on time. The event file path isn't showing here, but that's not a big deal. We know that we've got the right file set up. So that's your main information here. We don't typically use this information up here unless it's to pull a different file. You'll notice also that we have 4 main tabs here at the top of the screen: Events and Modes, HRV calibration settings, RPeak and artifact settings, and additional settings. We'll be using 3 out of the 4. The RPeak and artifact settings will not be used by us hardly at any time for any reason that I know of. The next important thing to point out is that we have this large screen right here with a number of event summaries. This is basically your programming. When you set up the initial file, you had a number of events that were automatically coded. We won't be using this information here either. All this information will be set for you prior, and will be set up in an analysis guide or in your editing notes. You'll be able to just draw from those times and insert them here at start times and end times when appropriate. Moving on to that, right here in the Events and Modes tab, you'll have the start time, the end time, and the segment time. The start and end times are pretty easy to adjust accordingly. Basically, you'll just set this up by double-clicking it, put in your time, and then click off of it. It's important that you click off of it, because if you put this time in and it's still highlighted and then click Analyze, the time will not change. And you'll notice once you go into the editing screen that the end time or the start time will not be correct. This is especially important for the end time because there's a tendency for some research assistants to click on this, put in the time, and then click Analyze, and it will not change. Another common mistake that's made is with the segment time. Sometimes it might be the case that you click around here or in here, and then use the middle scrolling button on your mouse, and it'll adjust it. The most common mistake that I've typically made is adjusting this to 0.1. It's important that you make sure that this is at 60. It will be pretty evident when you go into the program, and perhaps I'll show you that in a later video of how that mistake manifests once you go into the actual program. Before we move into the actual editing program, we're going to take a look at the calibration settings. This is perhaps the most important thing that you need to change. It's important that you check this at the beginning of each day. Typically, when you set up the program the first time, these settings will save, but it's absolutely imperative that you check at the beginning of each day, because if this is off, it'll force you to redo all of the work that you've done for that particular day. So in these settings, you'll need to make sure that respiration signal is set to Z0. This basically functions at your respiration, and when you're doing HRV analysis, you're not only looking at the interbeat interval, the heart rate setting, but you're also comparing it to respiration. So you need to make sure that calculation method's entire and that your respiration signal is at Z0. You won't make any adjustments here at the spectral analysis. However, you will make adjustments down here. Initially, when the program is set up, it's slightly off. I believe it's set at 0.12 here to 0.40. You basically want the very low frequency set to 0.003, 0.050, and then your low frequency set to 0.050 to 0.150, and your RSA set to 0.150 to 0.40. This will basically function as your RSA and heart rate variability information, or your bandwidths. The technicalities aren't important here. It's just important that you make sure that you absolutely have this set correctly. From there, we also have the additional settings. Here, if you had video in your experiment or collected in your experiment, you could pull from the video file here and take a look at that while you're doing your analysis. We're not going to be doing that for this study. The output files will always be set at Excel, and I believe that's preset, so you don't need to make any adjustments there. An additional thing you will need to look at times is your edit settings. This can be done by pulling from an edit file, and here you'll see that I've previously done these analyses. You can simply click on the editing file, press OK, and you'll see that it populates here. For the time being, we're going to take that out, and we're just going to take a look into the actual program just to see what it looks like. So we can do that by going back to the events and modes. I've got the start time set up here, and we are ready to actually go into the program. I'm just going to double check and make sure we've got all these basics covered. You see that everything is set up there. Now, before we go into the actual program, I just want to note that you're going to have a lot of things to cover once you actually get into the program. So it's important not to get too overwhelmed, and repeatedly watch this video if you need to. Okay, so we're going to pull up the HRV program and head in here and just take a look. The first thing you're always going to see once you bring up that the program is that you'll see that there's going to be an inversion check or invert check. Here, you basically need to know that the R spike is at the top rather than the bottom. In this case, it's clear that the ECG is the right side up. It's not inverted. It's very rare that the case that it is inverted, but if it is, you might want to ask your supervisor about it, because it's likely that the file was not properly collected or somehow changed or misconverted or something like that. So you basically just set no here, and it'll bring up your main screen. You'll see that mine's chopped off a little bit. This typically is not the case, but my screen settings are just a bit off. You can move these both around typically, and there's a lot of information to look at. You basically see your file up here. This is your segment up here. You'll see we're in the first segment, but you can click on this right here, and you have options to move around through your file or through your segments. You can also make those adjustments by simply clicking on this button here, or you can also use page up and page down on your keyboard. I highly suggest getting used to these keyboard functions because it takes a lot of time to move your mouse back and forth across the screen if you're in the process of editing. The pertinent information that you're going to need on this main screen is your ECG channel here, in which you can see any edits that you're going to need to make. This segment right here is perfect. In fact, you see all these blue dots up here. All those blue dots means that you have valid R spikes, or the valid markers at the top of all these R spikes. The second module down here, the IBI, basically tells you any kind of variation from R to R spike. So in this case, you see like a slight peak right here. This essentially means that you have a slightly more of an increase between the R spikes in this particular area. and you'll see this variation throughout. It's not an issue that you have the variation. In fact, sometimes we actually want more variation. That's indicative of a healthier individual who's participating in the study. So don't be freaked out if you see large jumps. However, you will see in some cases that there'll be very abrupt spikes, and that's usually indicative of a mismarking or some other issue. So we'll go into that further in another analysis video. For the time being, you simply need to know this and this. These two modules are going to be important for you. Furthermore, you're going to need to know this. You're going to take a look at this heart rate information here frequently. You'll also see that the mean heart rate is down here. You'll see that mean IBI is down here, and you have the number of valid R spikes within this segment. Typically, that's the only information that you'll need to know, except for the RSA down here. And even when you're going through normal files, it's not usually the case that you use these a lot. It's only the case that you use them in case you need to really interpret. Again, we'll go into this in a future video. One other cool function is that you see a waterfall plot right here of all the ECG data in this particular segment. You can mess around with this. It's fun to look at. It doesn't really tell you very much unless you're an expert at really understanding what the ECG data means and how to interpret it. So for the time being, it's really just important that you see this, you see all the information in this main screen. All this additional information down here is important if you're an expert and you can interpret it. However, it's unlikely that you'll probably know what that means. In connecting what we just set up in our previous screen in the settings, you notice that we set up a very, very low frequency, a low frequency, and a high frequency, or RSA. These spaces here essentially correspond to those settings. So basically, this is the very low. This tells you how much of the area under here corresponds to the very low frequency, how much corresponds to the low frequency, and how much corresponds to the high frequency. Again, you won't need to know this information. It really only helps you if you're an expert and you can interpret that. For the time being, we're just trying to quantify the R spikes. So those are the basics of this main screen. Next, we're going to go into the edit Rs. This essentially allows you to make any edits you need to the data. And you'll notice that this even has more information than the last screen. So we'll kind of go through it here in 3 or 4 steps. The first one, you'll see at the top, we have 5 separate modules in this kind of first row here. You have your sensitivity, which won't typically be used in HRV. However, we will use that a little bit later in the BPV. We have a snap to peak function, a mid-beat auto peak function, as well as 2 other diagnostic modules. These will not be used at all, but you will use these 2 center modules. The reason is because the snap to peak function will be helpful at some points, and others it will be a complete burden. Same with the mid-beat auto peak. So we'll kind of wait until later videos to see how those work precisely. For the time being, I'm going to actually turn them off because I typically turn them off when I do my analysis. In the second row, you'll see many of the buttons you'll be using to actually do the editing process. You'll see we have delete and insert. These are the most commonly used buttons in the HRV program. We'll click on delete. You'll notice that it has F1 and F2 underneath of it. On my particular keyboard, it doesn't work, but typically these are the buttons that I use when I do research or when I do these editing processes. So you'll click on F1 and F2. Again, it'll be important for you to get used to those keyboard functions, as it'll make the process much, much quicker when you're actually doing the work. The other key button that you're going to need to know and use is the mid-beat. And I'll show you in a little bit later what this means. You can see that it doesn't work if you just click on it randomly, but we can take a look and kind of maybe force the issue here. So we'll wait just a moment to do that, but for now you get delete, you get your insert, and you get your mid-beat. 2 other functions that are somewhat used, but somewhat rarely used, are features that allow you to delete data in large portions. That's delete all points between X cursors and delete all points between Y cursors. Since we really don't have data to delete here, I'm going to kind of bypass those buttons until we run into some data that we would need to get rid of. This remove data portion is somewhat misleading. It doesn't just delete the markings that you have, but in fact deletes all of the data. You never will use this in HRV, however, this will become important in blood pressure variability. Okay, so that covers the top portion of it. Here you see in this middle that you have all your HRV data. I'm going to zoom in just to take a look at it a little bit better. Okay, here you can see that you have ECG data as well as your respiration data in the back. And by respiration, I mean the Z0 data that you're pulling from. So you can see those interacting, and you can even change the color if you want. You can bring over here and turn it yellow or whatever suits your eyes the best. I'm going to go out and come back into that window, and we're going to take a look at some zooming features down here at the bottom. So first off, this is a marking tool. You can see here that you can mark and delete points with this particular function, and it shows up as a cross, and that's typically what I refer to it as. In addition, you have a number of zooming features. Here, this will allow you to zoom in on specific data. I don't particularly like this feature, just for the fact that it doesn't, it typically causes more problems than anything. I'm going to zoom out and come back in here. This is the feature that I typically use, and this essentially allows zooming, but only on the x-axis. In this way, you don't have to negotiate any kind of zooming on the y-axis. It simply just allows you to bring in closer and look at the information you needed. So remember that I pointed out in the last video that you're really only going to be focusing on variation on the x-axis and not the y-axis. So it's really not needed to zoom in on the y-axis any more than this. So again, I would suggest using just this, although you see from these other ones that you will have the capability to zoom in with other in other ways. I'm going to skip these for now, just for the fact that I rarely, if ever, use these. And I'll show you another feature here called the hand. This hand allows you to kind of grasp the data and move it around at will, move back and forth both on the y and the x-axis. So rather than zooming it, perhaps it's just best to zoom in on the x-axis and then use your hand to kind of pull around. The one thing you will need to be careful with all of these features is that if you have F1 or F2 on, you can easily impute data or delete data that you didn't necessarily want to. So the most notorious for this is the insert button. You'll see that all I want to do here is pull my data, and because I left F2 on, I accidentally marked a point right here, which causes the RSA to be changed drastically. You'll just see that here there's a false marker put in, and every time that I scroll over, it's going to constantly do this. This process can be overturned by just simply turning the insert off, but you can come back and delete these same points using that function as well. I typically will use the cross to do all my inserting and deleting. I use this tool to zoom, and I simply use this to pull, but I typically turn F1 and F2 off. I would suggest doing those same things, but if you have techniques or if you have techniques that help those processes a little bit better, then it's important for you to develop your own style, and that's perfectly fine as well. These maneuvering techniques are just the most helpful that I have found up to this point. So that was everything in the editing window. Those should be all the main functions that you're going to need. And coming back to this main analysis window, I just want to point out the RPeak and artifact and the video settings are not really going to be used in our analysis at all. The only other things that we really need from here on are the write and done buttons. So the done should be straightforward. Basically, by clicking on it, it allows you to come back to the main window. You're going to need this in the process that, or in the example that you edit one section of the data, and then you need to change your start and end times, and then you can change those times and then easily go back in to do your second analysis. Further, what you're going to need is this write button. The write obviously writes output data. And you can see this process take hold when you go to write your data. You'll go ahead and just, since we have all the editing already finished, we'll go ahead and edit. You simply create new. Now, typically that automatically just outputs data to an Excel file. The reason why you don't see it do it on my computer is because I have a newer version of Excel that does not correspond to the HRV analysis. Of course, when you're doing this research at the Institute, you'll have that older version of the Excel file or Excel program. It'll automatically output that data, and then once you're completed fully with either manually writing those or auto analyzing all of the data to that Excel output file, then you can just come up here and click Done. Okay. In fact, you'll see here that, nope, that did not work. Anyways, so that covers everything that you'll need except for this one last feature. And this, again, won't work necessarily with the process that I'm showing you because I do not have the newest version of Excel. Basically, what this feature allows you to do is auto-analyze all of them. So rather than going through every single segment as I just showed you, I outputted only one segment. You'll see that that's actually a process that you can do completely automated. And that can be done simply by coming up here, auto-analyze all data segments. You'll go ahead and make sure that your start time and your end time are correctly. Remember that when you put in your end time, you put in the correct time, and then click off of that, make sure that it saves like that, and then simply go press Analyze. Once you analyze, it'll automatically output all of that data to an Excel file. It'll tell you that it's finished after it's completely done, and then you'll just press Done, coming back to the main screen, and you can click out of your Excel file, which it automatically saves in the correct place. So that's a general overview of the main window, the editing window, and all the calibration settings that you'll need within the Mindware HRV program. For the time being, I think we're going to just make sure that we've got everything taken care of, which I do believe we have. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask Brandon, Emily, or Eddie about the additional features that this program has.